Hello and welcome. You join us at the 2020 Malta Book Festival for a very special Q&A with a writer who is widely considered to be one of the most important, influential and celebrated authors of the past 50 years. He's written 14 novels, a book of short stories and 4 works of non-fiction. His work has attracted countless prizes. Midnight's Children, perhaps his most celebrated novel, not only won the Booker Prize when it was published, but it has since been judged on 2 separate occasions to be the very best of all the Booker Prize-winning books. It's therefore a great honor and privilege to be joined from New York by Sir Salman Rushdie. Salman, welcome.
Hello, how are you? How are you?
Good, thank you.
Yes.
Before proceeding, let me explain the format of today's Q&A session. In anticipation of this event, we asked members of the general public here in Malta to submit questions that they would ask Salman Rushdie if given the opportunity in, of course, a pre-COVIDian existence. Unsurprisingly, we were inundated. So my job tonight is to try to synthesize those questions as best I can and to touch on some of the most popular themes and topics covered. At certain points during the discussion, I'll cue in some of the people who wrote in and give them an opportunity to ask their question to Salman Rushdie directly. But first of all, I'd like to ask you your thoughts, Salman, on this extraordinary year, 2020, both in terms of your own personal experience of things like lockdown, what that has been like for you, but also your broader perspective on the issues that we see from afar. We've all seen the rather shocking footage of mass COVID burials in New York. And of course, at the moment, we have this extraordinary situation in the White House, which seems to be, to all intents and purposes, the early stages of an attempted coup. So in the context of all of this upheaval and madness, how are you?
Well, as you say, it's been quite a year for all of us. I found recently a New Year's Eve photograph of myself celebrating the incoming 2020, and little did we know what we were celebrating. As far as I'm concerned, I actually am one of the lucky people who had the illness and recovered. I got it quite early on in March, and was quite unwell for a couple of weeks. But I was fortunate in that I didn't have the worst version of the illness. I didn't have the breathing difficulties, which are the real danger. And so I was an early victim of this thing. And since then, in this country, we're now, I think we've crossed the 240,000 death barrier, which is horrifying. Horrifying, especially as it's pretty clear that with a different kind of administration, many of those deaths could have been prevented. As far as the attempted coup is concerned, I'm not really sure that he's going to succeed in doing that. The election result is pretty clear, and the people are going ahead and certifying the vote. And in December, the Electoral College will meet and will vote, and that'll be the end of that. And if he has to be dragged kicking and screaming from the White House, I'd quite like to see that.
Fiction, of course, and the arts more generally have been a source of solace for many people at this difficult time. And yet so many people who work in the arts, musicians, theatre workers in particular perhaps, have borne the brunt of some of the economic hardships that have been a consequence of COVID and the attendant restrictions. Do you think we are, as a society, guilty of taking the arts for granted?
Well, I wish that we could see that they are in fact essential. That's to say, people turn to the arts, particularly in times of distress and trouble, as a way of trying to understand the situation that they're in, and it's always been a function of the arts to offer that, to society in difficult times. And for some reason, we don't. I mean, many countries, this country, the United Kingdom, many countries fail to recognize that the arts are essential in that way. I mean, I think the effect, as you say, the effect on the performing arts has been close to calamitous. And rather strangely for me, in this year, when all the theaters in the world are shut, I found myself writing my first play, which I've now finished. The most useless object one could produce in this year is a play which cannot be staged because there's nowhere to stage it. But you know, one has to hope that the world will return slowly, and that theatre will return sooner rather than later. I'll be very happy to be able to be part of that return when it happens.
Yeah, it seems like a literary act of hope, in fact, writing drama now.
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, many of the questions that we received are curious about your thoughts on the responsibility of writing and the responsibility of writers at this difficult time. Emma Baril, for instance, goes so far as to ask, why is it still worth writing a novel in 2020? And Rebecca Zamit wonders what a writer can do to raise socio-political concerns without sounding like a broken record in a world endlessly saturated with stories. And this reminds me of your essay, Outside the Whale, in which you take George Orwell to task for what you perceive to be his quietism. And you recommend instead, I think you call it rowdyism, making as much of a clamor as possible. I wonder, in a world endlessly saturated with stories, to use Rebecca Zamit's phrase, is this still the best way of breaking through the noise, do you think?
Well, it's one of the ways. You know, I mean, I think I don't make a distinction here between the various narrative arts, you know, between whether we're talking about the novel or theater or cinema. You know, of course, as the arts become more expensive, they become more difficult to produce in this time. You know, one of the great advantages of the book is that it can be produced by somebody sitting alone in a room, and doesn't require a theater, doesn't require a film studio, doesn't require anything like the apparatus that the other arts require, which is why the other arts are in more trouble. But what I think is this, that what's the point of doing it? We are creatures who have always used stories as ways of understanding ourselves. It's one of the things human beings have always done. I've often used the phrase that we are the storytelling animal. You know, that there is no other animal on earth that does this. And so stories fulfill a very deep need in human beings. And I think, well, to put it at its most, if you like, contemporary, we live in an age of lies. We live in an age in which an enormous amount of public life is filled with the sound of people lying to us. And certainly in this country, that's been truer in the last 4 years than at any time that I can remember. And there's a very important distinction, I think, between lies and fiction. That's to say that fiction, literature, its purpose is to approach the truth. It can do so by all sorts of means, some of them naturalistic, some of them surrealist. But the purpose is to tell the truth about human beings, about how we live together, about what we do with each other, about how things are. You know, and the art of the novel is definitely an art which is dedicated to the truth. You know, whereas the lie is a way of obscuring the truth. You know, so in many ways, these are opposed things. You know, and it may be that in the age of the lie, the novel actually has a purpose. You know, I mean, I slightly resist if you like, the kind of utilitarian view of literature, that literature exists for a purpose. I think literature exists to be beautiful, and to please people and to challenge people, but it doesn't exist, to achieve any simple social goal. What it does do, I think, is to engage readers in a dialogue about what the truth is, about what the world is like. And when we like a book, when we love a book, some part of us accepts the vision of the world that the book is offering us, and that becomes a part of our vision of the world. And I think that's what books can do in a time like this. I think, rather than to offer some kind of polemical viewpoint, because polemics don't last, and certainly if you're my kind of writer, you want to write books that will endure, that will have some kind of lasting value.
That actually leads in nicely to some of the other questions that were sent in. You're clearly not, as your answer there has just demonstrated, you're clearly not a didactic writer, and yet mixed in with the abundant pleasures of your writing, I think there is a degree of instruction, even if that instruction is never direct. And so one question that came to mind in the questions that were sent in is that, despite the lightness, fluidity, and wit of your writing, the zip and zing of your writing, you do take on deadly serious contemporary issues. And we've had numerous questions on your bravery and courage in doing this, from Sandra Dingley, Jasmine Vassallo, Jasmine De Battista, and Kirk Greck. And if I could sum up all of these questions, I think it would be, how important is moral conviction to you as a writer?
Well, I think the truth is that I do believe that art is in essence a moral exercise. I think that the art of literature is engaged with the question of what is the good, what is right action and what is wrong action, and these are questions that human beings ask themselves. We ask ourselves all the time. And it's a very problematic thing, because essentially we all tend to think of ourselves as in some way good. Very, very few of us think of ourselves as bad people. And yet it's not possible that all of us, in fact, are good people. So there's an element of self-deception in many human personalities, and it's part of the project of art to see that, to see when people are behaving badly while they think they're behaving well. There's the famous example of Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American, in which his central character, Pyle, in what was then Indochina, believes that he's acting for the best at all times, and yet wreaks complete havoc wherever he goes. And so, yeah, I do think that there is a moral vision in most good art, but as you say, the difficulty is not to make it preachy. I don't like, as a reader, I don't like to read books that are wagging a finger at me and telling me how to think, because my view as a reader is that that's my job. I'll be the judge of that. But I do think what a book can do is to create a world in which the reader, first of all, in which the reader enjoys being, but also in which the reader can be faced with serious questions, and needs to find his or her answer to those questions. So, yeah, I think a book without any kind of ethical sense would be not to my liking, I have to say.
Mention of the lightness and wit of your writing brings us to a topic that a lot of people are very interested in, which is your use of humor and wit more generally. Clara Ketkuti, for instance, was interested in the irreverent tone that you're able to conjure, and many people, including Robert Pisani, were curious as to whether the jokes in your writing are planned or spontaneous. And at this stage, I'd like to cue in Christine Caruana, who extends this line of questioning in what I think is a rather delightful way. Christine, are you there?
You often speak about the dangerous power of comedy and the admiration you have towards writers of the alternative great tradition, like Rabelais, Gogol, Kafka, so with whom you share a love of grotesque humor. All this is keenly felt in your novels as well, but I've often wondered, to what extent, if at all, do you change elements of plot and character for the impulse to elicit a laugh, or for the sake of an irresistibly elegant punchline? In the sense, are you as the author in full control over the reader's funny bewitchment? Or does comedy hold a spell over your writing as well?
You know, it's such a good question. And well, I would say one thing, what I don't do is to shape what I'm doing to lead up to some kind of gag. You know, I mean, I'm not in that sense a kind of jokesmith. You know, and to my mind, if there's comedy, it has to arise out of character and situation. And in many ways, I'm led by those things. I'm led by the character. I'm led by the situation, and very often, things that I put down, I'm not actually sometimes I don't know that people are going to find them funny. I'm very often, people who read my books tell me that such and such moment they found, you know, made them laugh, and I didn't think it was going to, you know. So there's a part of comedy which can surprise even the author. I mean, in general, I think what I try and do is to have humor in everything that I say, because as a reader, I don't like books that are completely humorless. Even some very great books that are completely humorless, I find problematic. And so, to some degree, this is just how it comes out. You know, the writing comes out this way because this is what I like to read. But no, I mean, I think it would be completely pretentious to say that I'm completely in command of the material. You know, I find more and more, as I've gone on, that writing has become not a carefully pre-planned act, but an act of discovery. You know, when I started out a long time ago, I used to need very, very careful architecture and planning, and if I didn't have that, I was unable. I mean, I was unable to get going. Now I find that obviously I have some sense of what I'm doing, but I'm very much more willing to see what shows up on the page on a given day, you know. And the way in which I think of this is that earlier kind of writing had more in common with, if you like, classical composition, where you compose something. And this kind of writing has more in common with jazz, if you like, where it feels more, that it allows more room for improvisation. You know, and I mean, I remember, you know, Toni Morrison, who I enormously admired and was lucky enough to know somewhat, wrote a novel called Jazz, and I remember interviewing her and asking her whether she allowed elements of improvisation to be part of her writing process. And she said, "Well, I'd like to make you think that that's what I'm doing," which was a way of not answering the question. But I mean, I do sometimes. I like to surprise myself on the page, you know, and find the story acquiring an unexpectedness, and then having to decide if that's good or bad. And sometimes that can have to do with comedy, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Salman, your insights there into how you write lead us neatly into another series of questions, because many of the people who sent questions in are not just keen readers of your work, they're aspiring writers too. And so there are lots of questions about the writing process, your particular writing process. Your books, of course, are full of fiction. You know, they're often metafictional. And some of them, such as Midnight's Children, dwell on the writing process, as David Hudson, who wrote in, points out, whereas elsewhere it's often taken for granted. For instance, your latest work, Keyshot, is, among other things, a story about a writer and a story. However, the actual writing of the story isn't given much attention. And so a lot of people wanted to ask you to expound a little bit on your own writing process, what your routine is like, where you find inspiration, and of course that age-old question, how do you deal with writer's block? And we've had questions from Christine Gallia, Charlene Zamit, Tommy Fennick, Liam Carl, Adjus Camilleri, and many others on these topics.
Yeah, I mean, well, to take the last thing first, the way in which I deal with writer's block is I refuse to accept that it exists. And what happens, you know, when you finish a book, or when I finish a book, characteristically, I feel very hollowed out. I feel kind of excavated, you know, and as if there's nothing left in my brain. And it's a worrying feeling, because you wonder if it'll ever fill up again, and if anything will show up that is worth thinking about or writing about. That happens every time. And one of the things I guess that you learn from having been doing it for a long time is that actually the tank does refill. You know, and it can just take different amounts of time. I mean, there have been moments when, for example, with Keyshot, when I actually had the idea for the book while I was still writing the previous book, and so it was very quick to move from one to the other. There have been other times when I've had a period of a year, or even a little bit more than a year, when I have not been clear what I should do next, you know, and what I've come to think is that period, that kind of, if you like, fallow period, is just a different kind of creativity, because what happens is that I work just as hard in that time when I don't have a book to write. And I sit every day at my desk and just see what is in my head. See what it might have to do with something I've read, or something that just cropped up across my field of consciousness. You know, I just put down whatever is there, whether it's the germ of a character, or whether it's just a sentence, or whether it's a thought about something, you know, and I just work on it. And usually the next day, I can understand that everything that I did yesterday was garbage, you know, and then I try and think about today's garbage, you know, and what happens out of that process of being in a constant dialogue with yourself, and in some kind of constant dialogue with the world outside yourself, just working, you know, working without a goal. Gradually, what happens with me is that something that I've been thinking about starts sticking. I wake up in the morning and I'm still thinking about the thing I was thinking about yesterday, you know? And characteristically, that's how the books begin. I begin to then ask myself, why is that thing sticking in my head? You know, what is it about that thing that is interesting me? And so you see, it's not completely an act of will. Some of it is half unconscious. You know, you interrogate yourself. Why am I thinking about this? You know? And if I am thinking about this, what do I do with it? You know, and the books emerge from that. You know, so yeah, sometimes you're lucky and you know exactly what you want to do next. You know, it's said of Anthony Trollope that when he finished a novel, he would not allow himself to rise from the desk until he had written the first sentence of the next novel. Um, I don't think all of us are able to do that. Of course, Trollope wrote novels, many of which were long sequences of novels, so in which the same characters continued, so it might have been a little easier to do. But yeah, in my case, there's no rule really. The gap between books can be very short or very long. This year, for example, I mean, partly because of the weirdness of this year, I think, like many writers, I've actually found it quite hard to get going, you know, and certainly for the first half of the year, I was doing a version of what I've just been describing, which is sort of starting things out, trying things out, and then thinking, you know, I just don't like that at all. That's just not very good, and putting it aside. And I had at least 6 months of that, you know, and it's only now in the second half of the year that I feel that I've begun to have some sense of the direction to go in.
And do you have any particular routines or observances as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an early in the morning person, you know. I mean, I have friends who, you know, who set the alarm clock for 5 a.m. and you know, are at their desk at 6 a.m. and have done their day's work by lunchtime, and have the rest of the day available to, you know, have fun, drink. But I've never been any good at that. I'm better at night than in the morning, you know. But I mean, normally, I kind of work a 9 to 5 day. I mean, I sort of get up in the morning and have a cup of coffee and go to my desk, and do like something close to an office day. But what I do feel, I mean, the one piece of advice I can give perhaps is that I feel that we wake up every day with a little ball of creative energy for that day, you know, and we can waste it, you know, if we make phone calls or write emails or send text messages or kind of surf the web or all the things that there are now for us to do at home. That energy can be dissipated, and by the time you get to try to do your writing, it's gone. So my view has always been, the writing comes first, before you do anything else. You know, no matter how important other things may be to do, if there are unpaid bills, you know, if there are people screaming at you for things that you're supposed to have done last week, doesn't matter. The writing comes first. And when you have done your writing for the day and used that bit of creative energy, then you can do everything else. But that's been my lifetime process, is the work comes first. And I think it's a very simple piece of advice, but I think, and sometimes hard to follow, you know, but it's worth thinking about that.
It sounds like excellent and truly galvanizing advice. One question we had concerned something that I think is much bigger in the States than it is in Europe, though of course it's becoming more and more popular here, which is the kind of the creative writing course. And Marcus Brewster wants to know your opinion on creative writing courses and the kind of advice they impart, you know, the more formulaic advice of the 3-act structure and so on.
Yeah. Well, I have never taught creative writing. Although I've taught in American universities now for something over 15 years. I have always preferred to teach literature. I preferred to approach the subject of writing through texts which are worth scrutinizing and examining. You know, and for me, that's the best way. You know, I myself never studied English literature. I mean, my subject was history. I was a historian before I was a writer of fiction, and that has had a lot to do with how I think about writing. I think history, whether ancient or recent or contemporary history, has always been somewhere close to what I end up thinking about. But I never studied literature, and so now I find myself teaching it, which is also a way of studying it. And that's enjoyable to me. I teach one semester a year at New York University, and that's I enjoy that. As far as teaching writing itself, I used to have a low opinion of the creative writing course. I used to feel that yes, it's possible to teach craft. There's no question. It's possible to teach people how to be better than they are just by giving them craft skills, um, uh, and helping them to hone their craft skills. What I worried that there was a kind of sameness about people emerging from literary writing courses, and in a way they all came out writing the same way, and that seemed problematic. I've actually become. I don't quite feel that anymore. I think it may just be that the way in which creative writing is taught now, the number of very, very fine writers who are involved in teaching it, has changed that. I mean, I know that at NYU, you have Zadie Smith and Jeffrey Eugenides, and I mean, all sorts of wonderful writers teaching such courses, and I think that must be very exciting to be on. I mean, I wouldn't mind being in Zadie's class, frankly. And so I've changed my mind, really, about it. I now think that there is a use in it because, again, it's a temperamental thing. I think there are writers who benefit from a group. There are writers who benefit from showing their work and talking about it and discussing it and getting notes and feedback from a group. Those writers, I think, would be really helped by a creative writing course. There are writers like me who are extremely scared of unveiling writing when it's unfinished. I find the writing is far too vulnerable. It's very easy to become discouraged about it. Going back to the question about comedy, if I think something's funny and I read it to you and you don't think it's funny, that's really very depressing. So I think it's to do with your own personal temperament. I think there are people for whom that collective act is valuable, and I think there's a lot for those people to gain. And there are other, a lot of writers are by nature solitary beings, and those writers, I think, would do well to remain solitary.
In thinking about the diversity of different forms of contemporary literature, I would here like to cue in Ambrose Gallia, who has a question specifically about literature's contemporary evolutions. Ambrose, are you there?
Yes. Hi.
Hello.
Sir Rushdie, looking at your career from the outside in, from Grimus and Midnight's Children to Quixote, it would seem as if you've moved between different degrees of metafiction. Not only writing about about places and your relationships with them, but also about what constitutes these spaces, how they are formed, and how they might yet be changed. Yesterday, you called yourself a great metamorphosist, which you are. So with the notion of transformation and rebirth and even metamorphosis in mind, where do you think literature is going? Where do you think it should go? And if you could invent literature anew for this era, where would you begin?
Whoa. All right. How long have you got? that's a very,
I apologize.
It's a good question, but it's a really big one. Well, to speak first of all, just for the earlier part of your question, to talk about my own thoughts on this. For me, because of my life having been divided essentially between three big cities in three different countries, the question of place is very important to me. Unless and until I have to know the exact place and time in which a story is going to be set before I can begin to think about it. I mean, there are writers, particularly writers who have lived in one place all their lives, for whom place is a kind of given. That it doesn't need to be something they start with. If you're William Faulkner, you have Yoknapatawpha. You don't need to worry about it. It's there. Oxford, Mississippi is there outside your window. If you're a writer like me, you have to really worry about it. If you don't have to use the title of one of my novels, if you don't have ground beneath your feet, then, then the wheels can't turn. So there's that. As to where literature is going, I mean, one of the things I think is very interesting in American literature right now is the way in which so many more, if you like, immigrant stories have come into American literature. American literature always used to be rich in immigrant stories, but they were very specific. They were either Eastern European Jewish immigrant stories, or they were Southern European Italian immigrant stories. And to some degree, coming up from Latin America, stories with a kind of Spanish background or Hispanic background. But now, here, we have writers literally from everywhere. We have writers from Africa, from Vietnam, from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from China, all redefining themselves, if you like, as American writers, and by doing so, redefining American literature, because the stories of the world pour in and make the literature of this country much less parochial than maybe once it might have been. I really like that. It's very, and it's a thing happening in a generation much younger than mine, and I think it's quite rare for writers to be inspired by generations younger than themselves. We are all looking at the great forebears. We're all in dialogue with the great dead. But I find that I've been really excited by the work being done by these younger writers from elsewhere. Like, I mean, for example, this year, Maza Mengiste's book, The Shadow King, wonderful things are happening in African literature, largely because there's a generation of young women writers. African literature, particularly sub-Saharan literature, was dominated by giant male figures for a long time. There was Ngugi wa Thiong'o, there was Chinua Achebe, there was Wole Soyinka, and the biggest woman writer you could name in that generation would have been Nadine Gordimer, but she was a white woman. And now we have a range of brilliant young African writers from all over the continent reinventing the literature. So I see literature as being in the process of reinvention, and being actually in quite an exciting moment. So, for example, I think in America right now, there's a generation of African American writers who are completely taking charge of American literature. You have writers like Jesmyn Ward, who had won the National Book Award twice before she was 30, and Colson Whitehead, and poets like Natasha Trethewey and Tracy K. Smith, and nonfiction and fiction writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates. And there's a real surging generation of Black writers, in many ways paralleling the increasing interest in the subject of what it is to be Black in America, and of course the racism that is the counterpart of that. So I think literature is actually in quite a healthy state in terms of the productivity and originality of the people doing it. I think if there's a worry, it's whether the readers are still there. I mean, I think I don't quite know the answer to that. I think they are for some writers, and for others, I think it gets harder to find readers, and that I think is more of a concern.
Despite the contemporary transformations of the literary that you've just discussed in response to Ambrose's question, you yourself seem firmly attached to the novel and its seemingly endless possibilities. And the fact, of course, that Quixote is a loose adaptation of Don Quixote by Cervantes, which is generally considered to be the first novel as such, seems to nail your colors even more firmly to that mast. It's a form that seems particularly well suited to what I would call the incredible centrifugal force of your imagination, which is always moving outward, but crucially always connecting. And I was struck by just one example that I thought I could recount for perhaps for the benefit of people at home following this discussion. I think it's illustrative. So one of the concerns, of course, of Keyshot is the current opioid crisis in the US, which is blighting many communities. And a line that recurs in the book is, turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. And of course, many people will recognize that from the Beatles' song Tomorrow Never Knows, written by John Lennon. But he, of course, took it from the psychedelic experience, the book by Tim Leary, Ralph Messner, and Richard Alpert, a book that was dedicated to Aldous Huxley, who, of course, recounts his own experience with psychedelics in The Doors of Perception. And the book also, of course, deals with the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is a book about enlightenment and spiritual questing, which is another topic dealt with at great length in Keyshot. So from one apparently throwaway pop reference, we're led down a rabbit hole, and it's not a rabbit hole that leads you away from the themes, it's a rabbit hole that amplifies the themes and brings out yet further connections. And there seems to be something like that happening at every turn in your work. And the question I have is whether that profusion is a deliberate effect. Is it what delights you as a reader? Or is it simply how your mind works?
Well, it's both. It's both. I mean, I think it's important for any writer to recognize the kind of writer that they are, and the kind of things that they are more successful at and less successful at. I mean, I don't think, for example, that I would be very good at writing a minimalist novel. I think there are people who do that with much greater skill than me, to take some very, very simple thing and turn it in the light and show beautiful things from it. I mean, I envy it. I envy that skill, but I have to understand that it's not mine. What I do think that I admired as a reader before I became a writer was the kind of writer who embraced the abundance of the world. The kind of writer who wanted to take great armfuls of the world and bring it into the book. And I mean, Charles Dickens is a writer of that kind. Saul Bellow is a writer of that kind. Doris Lessing was a writer of that kind in a very different vein. I like that sense of hyperabundance and of the consciousness that the story you're telling, the story of the human beings who are your characters, is always in the context of a world of other stories, which you are choosing not to tell. That your story has to, so to speak, push its way through a crowd of stories. And then we have to understand why it is that this particular story is being told. But the context of multitude, is always there. And I think some of this has to do with when I started out, like when I was writing Midnight's Children. Of course, one of the most obvious facts about India is multitude. That this is a gigantic country of, well, then it was not as many hundreds of millions of people as it is now, but still hundreds and hundreds of, now over 1 billion people. How do you find a story to tell when there is such a crowd of stories? It was a question I had to ask myself from the beginning, and in a way I've gone on asking it, So I also like rabbit holes, by the way. I mean, I think to find a little something which opens the key, the door to Wonderland, and you plummet into it, and it can take you a lot of places. And if you can stay in control of it, it can take you to places that you want to be, So this connects to that, which connects to that, which connects to that. I've always enjoyed that kind of process, and I think it actually is. Unfortunately, this is the way my mind works. So it kind of comes naturally.
Often the novel form exploits what happens when those stories, creativity, fiction itself come up against the hard kernel of reality, I suppose, when there is some sort of settlement between a subjective expectation and the hard reality out there. And we have a question from Luke McAuliffe, who I'd like to cue in, because he's interested in how Quixote might have turned out differently if the fantastical side of it had been more constrained by real life experience in a very particular way. I'll let Luke elaborate on that.
Okay.
Hi. So thanks. Yes, as Professor Corby was mentioning, I was wondering, with regards to the writing process of Quixote, you've spoken about how you originally planned on renting a car and basing the novel on a real life road trip, but that you eventually moved away from that idea as you didn't want to be limited by what actually happened in real life. So how does this differ from attempts at autofiction in, for example, another road trip novel, such as Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli, Fellow 2019 Booker nominee? I was wondering whether there would have been any disadvantages of having Keyshot be rooted in fact rather than in this mixture of various fantastical genres and techniques.
Well, first of all, let me say that Valeria's novel is a wonderful novel and was one of my favorite novels of last year, and justly acclaimed. It's a wonderful book, which everybody should read. And you see, I mean, I think what I would say is that although Quixote is much more, if you like, fictive, it plays a lot of games with different kinds of fictional form. You know, at certain points it's a spy novel, at other points it's a science fiction novel, and sometimes it's an absurdist novel, and so on. In spite of all that, it is very deeply rooted in the reality of the world it's trying to describe. So that, for example, there's a scene in the novel in a town in Kansas, which is a fictional town. It's called a town called Beautiful. And in this town, there's a couple of Indian American men at a bar, and a crazy guy with a gun comes in and shoots them, and one of them dies and one of them does not. And this was based on something that did in fact happen in a non-fictional town in Kansas. And I remember being very struck by seeing an interview on television with the widow of the dead man, who talked about how they had lived in this town for a very long time, decades. Their children had been born and raised there, and they thought of it as home, you know. And then she said, but now we have to ask ourselves, is there a place for us here? And it just, that sentence struck me, and I remembered it for a long time. And it actually in Keyshot, there is one of the characters asks that question: is there a place for us here? So even though the setting of the novel is fictionalized, it is rooted in truth, you know. And even in one of the most absurdly fabulous moments of the book, when Quixote and his Sancho arrive in a town where people are turning into mastodons. Where that came from was when I was, I guess, 20 years old. I was at Cambridge. I was actually cast in a production of Ionesco's play, The Rhinoceros, and in which set in a small French town where people are turning into rhinoceroses. And I remember as a young person being unclear what the play was about, and saying to the director, you know, what's going on here? What is this? And he said to me very kindly, he said, He said, Salman, it's about fascism. And I said, okay, but how is it about fascism? And he said, well, it's about what can happen in a town, in a community, in a country, where suddenly people who were your neighbors yesterday, people whose children were playing with your children yesterday, suddenly to you seem to have become monsters. They seem to have turned into something so alien and frightening that you can't speak their language, you can't talk to each other, you don't understand each other, you're afraid of each other. And that can happen in a society. And UNESCO is talking about Nazism, you know, and I thought, well, that's very good. I thought, and then when I was writing this book of mine, it suddenly struck me that maybe we're to some degree in that place again, where our neighbors seem so alien from us, so remote from us, across a chasm almost, that they could begin to seem monstrous to us, you know, and no doubt us to them, you know, and so I borrowed UNESCO's device of metamorphosis, and I just thought, I can't have rhinoceroses because he's got rhinoceroses, so I chose mastodons because I thought pink elephants are funny, you know, but what I'm saying is that reality is never very far, even from very, very highly fabulated material, you know, and I think, for example, in the term magic realism, the problem with the term is that when people use it or hear it, they hear the word magic and they don't hear the word realism, you know, whereas actually everybody who writes in this way will tell you that the work is very deeply rooted in the real world, and that's what makes it work, you know. So actually, Valeria's book and my book are not that far apart. What's different in them is technique, but what's not different about them is purpose. The purpose in both cases is to make a portrait of a real world.
Thank you, and thank you, Luke. One of the ways that Keyshot is very obviously embedded in our contemporary reality is through the numerous pop culture references. The eponymous hero is obsessed by daytime television, of course. And it seems as though the overwhelming popularity of what you have referred to as junk culture is analogous with the deadening effect, perhaps, of opioids and the opioid crisis. And I think many people would instinctively be inclined to agree with a condemnation of those mindless forms of popular distraction. But I wonder, what do you think is the real root here? You know, what is the cause of this desire for escape? And does the albeit playful criticism of junk culture risk further entrenching the various culture wars that we're seeing rage afresh?
Well, it would be flattering to think that a novel could entrench a culture war, but I think it more reflects the culture war that's already there. I think that you're right that the novel is about, in a way, as you've said, is about two different kinds of destructive addiction, if you like, you know, one chemical and one cultural. And I do think in the way that Cervantes felt that the romantic literature of his time was in danger of literally rotting people's brains. You know, I mean, he presents Don Quixote as somebody whose brain has been rotted by overconsumption of these novels. I think that this world, the cultural as well as the addictive world, is in danger of damaging our perception. You know, if the novel has like an author's message underlying it, it might be that, you know. And I think that this has to do with something that is much spoken about these days, which is the question of living in a kind of post-truth world, you know, in a world in which it has become very hard to distinguish what is truthful from what is untruthful. And that can be a kind of madness. You know, if we can't tell the truth from a lie, that is a kind of derangement, not unlike the derangement suffered by Don Quixote. You know, but with different sources. I mean, it did strike me that if Cervantes were alive today, what would be the targets of his satire? And I tried to make those the targets of my satire.
The question of home and indeed belonging feature strongly in Quixote, as it does, of course, in your other work. And here I'd like to cue in a question from Sandy Calea Portelli on this subject. Sandy, are you there? Go ahead.
The
Sandy.
protagonists of Quixote are all aware that although they believed themselves to have planted deep roots in their adopted homelands, those roots are neither as deep nor their welcome as warm as they may have thought. Would you say that the sense of always being an outsider has always been a migrant's reality, or would you say it's the result of major countries lurching further to the right?
You know, I've thought about this all my life, really. The way in which migrant communities exist in the country to which they come, and also what is their relationship to the country which they have left. Both are problematic questions. My view is that it's not. I don't have a completely despairing view of this. You know, I do think that anyone who lives in New York City sees the whole world walking down the street every day. People from literally everywhere who end up here. The large majority of the population of New York was not born in New York. It came here from somewhere else, sometimes somewhere else in America, but it's a city composed of people who have arrived in order to make their lives here, you know, and most of the time, that works pretty well. You know, most of the time in this city anyway, that reality, that composite reality made up of that kind of mosaic reality made up of people from everywhere jostling on the sidewalk, that works pretty well. So one shouldn't assume that this is only a tragic phenomenon, you know, but clearly there is bigotry and there is resentment of the other and of the outsider, and people who live in let's say in a majority white culture will experience that to some degree. You don't even have to be an immigrant, actually, because the major target of American bigotry is not the immigrant community, it's the African American community, who have been facing this kind of bigotry since the foundation of the nation. So it's complex, but I certainly felt that for my characters to make this car journey from the American Southwest all the way across the country to New York City and then back again to California, they cross the country twice. It would be absurd if they did not encounter any hostility of any kind, because that's not the American reality, sadly. You know? And so there are, I think, 4 occasions in the book in which they do encounter some kind of ugliness. Sometimes it's just verbal, and sometimes it's more violent and more physically dangerous. But unfortunately, this is the truth, you know. And as I say, it's not a truth limited to migrants. It's a truth also for people here in the most important ethnic minority, which is the black minority, who have experienced this all their lives and know a great deal about it. And there's a great deal that can be learned from their experience.
Thank you, Sandy. Speaking of home and belonging, there's a strong sense in Quixote that both of those things are tied in a very strong way to family and to familial love rather than perhaps romantic love. One timeless expression of parental love is, of course, the telling of stories to one's children. While I'd hesitate to categorize Luca and the Fire of Life and Haroun and the Sea of Stories as children's books per se, one of the people who wrote in, Martina Mifsud, would like to know more about your use of allegory through magic realism in those books specifically, and how you hope younger readers might respond to those elements.
Well, you know, those were books written for specific children. I mean, that's to say, each book was written for one of my two sons, and in both cases, the title character's name is my son's middle name. So my older son Zafar, his middle name is Haroun, and my younger son Milan's middle name is Luca. So that's where that came from. And the books were written very much in the first instance to please one reader. You know, and one might say in the way in which Lewis Carroll wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to please one reader, you know, and ended up pleasing, of course, countless millions of readers as a result. I mean, I remember my older son a long time ago asking me why I didn't write books he wanted to read. And Haroun was sort of my way of answering that. And then my younger son grew up and he said, "Where's my book?" So I had to do it again. And in both cases, the books take their inspiration from an enormous wellspring of classical, mythological, folkloristic stories, you know, and try and bring them into into the contemporary world, you know. So, for example, there's a collection of a Sanskrit collection of stories which originated in Kashmir, which actually a collection that's actually larger than the Arabian Nights, which is called the Ocean of the Streams of Story, Katha Sarit Sagar in Sanskrit. Katha, story, Sarit, stream, Sagar, river. And I thought, suppose there was such an ocean. Supposing, and as a metaphor for what the art of story and literature is, the idea of an ocean in which streams of story are constantly flowing, mingling with each other in order to make new stories, seemed to me like true, you know. And then the book develops a kind of plot because there's somebody trying to poison it, because there always are people trying to stop us telling stories, and that becomes the drama. And Luca and the Fire of Life took its inspiration from kind of other kinds of mythology, various forms of divine mythology, even though in itself it's not at all a religious book. So I mean, I've always been very, very interested in the oldest stories. You know, I mean, I think one of the reasons why they survive is because of their power as stories, and they have so much to show us. You know, for example, when I was writing The Ground Beneath Her Feet, I was thinking about the myth of Orpheus, and actually, if you take the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, you can tell it in less than 100 words. You know, it's quite a short story. You could, 7 or 8 sentences will tell the story, and yet here's this inexhaustible story that has been inspiring to us and has stayed alive for thousands of years. You know, and asks such interesting and profound questions about the relationship between art, love, and death. You know, that you can unpack it almost infinitely. And I mean, I found myself writing a 600-page novel, originating in this story that one can tell in 100 words. And I think that's one of the great powers of these old myths, these old stories, is that they're like compressed little bombs of meaning, and if you push them in the right way, they can explode.
In drawing the discussion to a close today, I thought it might be interesting to explore the idea of hope. Keyshot seems to end on a hopeful note. Keyshot is the sane man at the end of the book, and you've commented a number of times in interviews on the fact that you consider yourself to be a sort of incurable optimist. And you often quote the line from Gramsci, from Romain Rolland originally, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I wonder if you could say more about what that leaves us with. Does that attitude, which is a kind of hope against hope, does that help us to endure or to overcome?
I think it helps us to both endure and overcome, because it's a way of seeing the world which is not through rose-tinted spectacles, to try to see the world clearly, but refusing to accept despair as a response, and believing that something can be done about it. I mean, this is, I think, something which for me is more a way of leading my life than of writing my books, if you like. But I do think, I think, yes, one of the things that happened with Keyshot is that I gave him a magnified version of something that my friends poke fun at me for being too optimistic. We began this conversation by my saying that there's not going to be a coup in America. That may to some people seem absurdly optimistic right now. But you see, one of the other books that less discussed that stands behind Keyshot is, other than Don Quixote, is Voltaire's novel Candide, which is also about a kind of innocent fool traveling through a world which is not innocent. And actually the subtitle of Candide is optimism. The book is called Candide ou l'optimisme, and Candide also is an absurd optimist, along with the philosopher Pangloss, believing that they live in the best of all possible worlds, when they quite clearly do not. And I thought that to take this spirit of optimism and propel it through America at what might not be the most optimistic moment in American history, that the contrast between those two things, the friction between those two things, would provide me with the book, and so that's what I thought I was doing. But I do believe, and one of the things I think I took away from the study of history is that history doesn't run on tram lines. History is not inevitable. It doesn't proceed by a kind of inexorable logic. It's capable of making very sudden left turns without any notice. The world can change very suddenly and very rapidly without any warning. And I think we do live in that moment. I mean, we just had a terrible example of that in the coronavirus, which is something which changed everybody's lives for the worse almost overnight. But another example of that, the other way, is the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, that's to say, if in September 1989 I had told you that the Soviet Union would not exist at Christmas, you would have thought I was crazy. And yet, actually, it wasn't Christmas. It was about 2 days later. But you know what I mean. By the end of the year, this what seemed to be a powerful force that was simply there had simply blown away like dust. And so I think once you see how history is capable of that kind of very rapid metamorphosis, it's foolish to feel despairing, because the one thing you cannot tell is what the future will be. The future can be worse than we hope, it can be better than we hope. But it will be different than what we hope. So the question is to believe in our power to make it, I guess.
That sounds like a wonderful note to end on. I'd like to thank everybody who sent in questions. We got through a fraction of them today, and we were spoilt for choice. There were really some excellent questions sent in. So thank you to all of you. And Salman Rushdie, thank you very much for your generosity and for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. They were great questions.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.